Greetings, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all to this webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also called the North Central CASC, which is based at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, Climate Science Lead at the North Central CASC, co-hosting this webinar with my colleague, Heather Yoakum, who is our Social Science Lead. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you'll have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat box anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A period in the order they are received. We will end the formal part of this webinar at noon Mountain Time and stop the recording at that point. After that, anyone who wishes to stay on to engage in a more informal conversation with our speaker is encouraged to do so. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jeff Martin, our speaker for today. Jeff is the Director of Research for the Center of Excellence for Bison Studies at the West River Research and Extension Center in Rapid City, South Dakota. His interdisciplinary research focuses across wildlife biology, climatology, and human dimensions to answer questions of wildlife conservation and production in a changing world. Jeff's research on bison is at the nexus of two paradigms, changing climate and changing cultural values. His goal is to merge the understanding of conservation science with direct stakeholder engagement to improve conservation for wildlife across working and natural lands. He explores both direct and indirect drivers and consequences of body size change with a focus on the bison from the Great Plains. Jeff's research aims to include the interest of bison managers that include the diverse sectors of private, public, tribal, and NGO bison herds. Jeff also just enlightened me that he has been running around with bison since the age of 9. So his talk today is titled Sustainable Management of Bison in a Changing World. Jeff, thanks very much again for being here, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Imtiaz. I appreciate the introduction. Yeah, it's an absolute honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I think that a lot of my work aligns well with the goals of CASC, and I'm happy to dive into what we have today. Yep, so as the front slide is showing here, I've got some nice pictures of me with bison behind me. I'm also wearing a bison hair. That's a bison wool hat and scarf. And actually the jacket is also filled with bison wool for insulation. And so I am a true believer of bison. As MT has mentioned, I've grown up around bison on a bison ranch in Wisconsin since the age of 9. And so it's been a really fun road, and I'm going to share with you what I've learned over the years. Perfect. And so a little bit about the acknowledgements here. Research, as many of you know, cannot happen in a vacuum. It takes many, many, many people to help as a network and support structure. As opposed to a village, this is people from across many villages to help with research advancement. And so these are just a small representation of everyone that's helped me along the way. And I hope to continue to interact with many of you. And the obligatory permit numbers are on the bottom left. So real quick about me, we'll slide through this pretty quick, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. Yes, I grew up on a bison ranch in Wisconsin. It was a relatively small operation. I was then later a ranch hand on a much larger bison operation in western and South Dakota. So the difference there being between 50 animals at my parents' place, still in Wisconsin, as opposed to 2,500 animals in western South Dakota. So the scales of economy on either ends of that spectrum. I finished my bachelor's in geology at East Tennessee State University, stayed there for my master's in geosciences. Both of those really did focus on paleontology, so study of past life. And I was interested in how we apply those concepts to managing wildlife today. So conservation paleobiology is the catchphrase for that. I then pursued my doctorate in wildlife sciences at Texas A&M, where I applied some of that conservation paleobiology and then brought in elements of traditional modern wildlife science concepts. Since 2020, I've been the director of research at the Center of Excellence for Bison Studies at South Dakota State University. If you'd like to learn more, my website is here, and I'm on Twitter and Facebook, although less so lately, it's been busy. And so with that, we'll dive into our 3 topics that we're going to talk about today. Bison are an important, critical, even species for the Great Plains and adjacent ecosystems. They're considered ecological engineers, as well as keystone species. Their grazing type is time minimizing, meaning that they graze as they move. They don't hunker down in one spot, like we see with some beef cattle. They also create wallows. This is a distinct behavior that they have. These shallow depressions that are excavated from the soil are tiny little catchments for ponds and breeding pools for frogs in the spring. They often stay out of wet areas. They really like to be up in the drylands and the prairie. They don't like getting their feet wet, much like my dog. They're also an economic driver for rural populations. The bison industry, the private sector alone, is now topped 350 million annually. So that's quite a bit of change that's going to rural families to be sustainable. We also have a long storied history with the people of this continent as well as Eurasia. Bison have been around humans for tens of thousands of years. And so it's no different than what we have here today. They speak to many of us because that's probably speaking to an ancient reptilian part of our brain that we see these things and we identify with them. And so I'm going to make a little umbrella here. We're going to, in 3 short words, sustainable eco-agriculture of bison. I guess there's 4. And how I address that is with 3 pillars with scaffolding between them. One is going to be evolution, which provides our context, our background for understanding trends, patterns, and variation. And these are really, really helpful for establishing that curve that we are trying to understand and whether that curve is bending in modern times. And ecophysiology is the assessment of that mechanism driving that bending of the curve, if at all, or it helps explain why the curve is going in the way that it is. And so one of this is thermoregulation. I do here shown with the thermal image of a bison, nutritional intakes, rates of growth, and disease abundances. And then lastly, management. How do we apply what we've learned from ecology and evolution and ecophysiology to better inform management? But part of that is also understanding managers' perceptions. How do we best implement what we've learned if it doesn't jive with how managers perceive their problems? And so I use common currencies in the first 2 pillars. One of that is body size. So asymptotic body mass or mature body size. It's changing. It has been changing for bison for a long time, but the rate of change that we're experiencing now is unprecedented. We'll get into that here in a little bit. I also use watts of energy. That is a great currency for measuring thermal regulation, growth rates, and allocation and input of nutrition that's coming in, storage into fat stores and fat depots, and then use, like we said, thermal regulation and growth and maintenance. And so as we go along the top left, we have the different pillars that are going to be fading out that we're not talking about. And then in black is what we will be focusing on if you get lost here at the talk. So bison evolution. How do we know bison are changing? It's an important question because we want to know what it is that we are trying to understand, what is actually changing. And so what has shaped bison morphology? We need to have that context of understanding. And what was the distribution? Why were they in different places? And how did those places influence what they look like? Here's 3 papers that are highlighted that we will be mentioning today. And I try to provide those references in the bottom right-hand corner as we go through. So briefly, we're going to go through the evolution of bison in a minute. The fossil record of bison is long and storied, and it's even longer than what's shown here. In what is Beringia and into proper North America, bison priscus were among the first species to get into this new world. On the left side, that's about 2 million years ago, they were up in Beringia. Bison alaskensis is among those first that were here in Alaska. They were here approximately 300,000 years ago in Alaska. And then it's much later, until about 160,000 years ago, that we have our spread into the contiguous United States as those ice sheets opened up to allow passage. And so we had bison latifrons, the giant bison, a horn span of 9 feet. Bison antiquus, the ancient bison, the predecessor to today's bison, and then today's bison on the right. So the Ice Age is a much cooler time, as the name implies, than the age of today. And this diminution from Ice Age to today is what we're really focused on. So as we just briefly mentioned, spread from Eurasia into contiguous US about 160,000 years ago. There were roughly between 30 and 60 million bison at one time in North America. Note that's about the same number of beef cattle that we have on the landscape today. The map on the right is showing the distribution of bison as we best understand it, right at the year 1800 or so, so right after the 1700s, spreading into the late 1800s. And so notice this light to dark brown and then little black dots. That's a contraction of the distribution through time. And the black dots, they have a black number next to them. That is the population size of those last remaining herds as they were hunted and population declines from disease. They were brought down to less than 1,000 animals at that time, but 100 years later, we have recovered to nearly 400,000 bison today. Some of those are explained by conservation herds. So shown here on this map, we have about 56 conservation herds. I think this map is outdated at the moment because there are already conservation herds in Mexico that aren't shown here. Those conservation herds total to about 20,000. Give or take. The remaining 85% are split between private ranches, NGOs, which are part of the conservation, and tribal herds. So they can be found in most states and most Western Canadian provinces. If you want to go find one, there's probably one near you. There is a disputed distribution. Is this truly the full extent and representation of where bison were? Probably not. The best information that we have right now is how this was conducted by Joel Allen in 1876 and later William Hornaday, was that they sent out letters to postmasters in each region, said, have you seen bison, yes or no? And they brought that back, mapped it, and that's pretty much what they went off of. A brilliant attempt, but perhaps was missing some of the information. And in particular, if we focused on the Four Corners region, there wasn't a whole lot of people out here. And this Arizona, Nevada, and Utah corner in particular seems like there should be some bison there. And this was the focus of my master's thesis at East Tennessee State. And what we set out to do was go through the fossil archaeological collections at Grand Canyon and Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, and figure out with these big bags of bones, as they're labeled, and identify which species were actually there. And in many cases, some of these were misidentified. Some sites date to 1,000 years ago, and they said that this is cattle. I hope some of you are laughing, because we didn't have cattle in this continent until 500 years after that. So it wasn't even possible to have cattle 1,000 years ago, because they just weren't here. So it comes down to the ability to be able to distinguish bison from other species. And what we found was that there are well over 75 sites over the last 14,000 years that have bison. And when you break this up by time period, going from on this table, top old to the bottom young, present, on the right side, there are dozens of sites that were still within the last couple hundred years. And so what we concluded is that bison are considered a native species to the Colorado Plateau, because they have a nearly continuous record of inhabitants. This is important because prior to that, bison were thought to be non-native to this area. And when you have a species that's considered non-native, protected lands, particularly within the National Park Service and other neighboring federal agencies, and even state agencies, manage against non-natives to help native species. And so what this ended up doing was instigating an interagency bison management plan between the National Park Service at Grand Canyon and the Arizona Game Fishing Department. At the moment, yes, they are reducing the herd. They were likely overgrazing and damaging other ecological areas, but there's at least now a concerted effort between these agencies that share a boundary. And the bison themselves are the property of the state, but they keep migrating seasonally between the two boundaries. Most recently, they've stopped migrating. They just stay in the national park. You can apply these similar ideas to continental scope, which has just been a project that was just finished with the IUCN Bison Specialist Group. And really what this was focused on was getting a better handle on the historical extent of occurrence for bison. And so we wanted to blend three independent streams of information. So the top left is our historical ecology. Top right, B, is archaeology, so how humans have been interacting with bison at archaeological sites. Bottom left, C, is paleontology, the fossils, presence of animals without the interaction of humans. And in particular, if you notice on B and C, the black dots are indicating sites that occur from the year 1500 to today. And before that are grayed out. And so D, the bottom right, is showing all of those black dots that have been collated together. Those first three sum to about 6,400 sites. When we get into that historical context of D, from 1500 to today, there's 3,400 observations that contribute to bison distribution. And notice some differences from what we were showing earlier with that Hornaday and Allen map is this Southwest context and the Gulf of Mexico expansion, and this large expansion up into the Northwestern Territories and Alaska. Most of what we were showing with Hornaday and Allen before was the Great Plains. But what we've learned is that bison had about 59% of the continent covered. Now, not likely all at one time, but they could have been in these places at various times. And so those data help us become better acquainted with what data exists that we can explore. And so for me, getting into body size, I need the physical specimens to measure. And so that database serves as a great place to figure out where can I go to measure something. And I've done that with this data set that we're showing here, 2018 paper, is that 1,500 bison skeletons are very well articulated, and we have the entire skeleton, and we can measure some of these bones to get a better idea of body size. For sake of brevity today, we're only going to focus on the calcaneum, the heel bone. This black arrow is indicating to where that is positioned on the bison. Now we walk on our heel bone on the ground. They're actually ballerinas in the prairie. They walk on their tippy toes. And so that calcaneum is really useful for reconstructing body size. This distal tuber length, DSTL, this is where the Achilles tendon attaches. All of that musculature that comes down, it's a really good armature for figuring out how big bison were. Other animals too, not just bison. So that DSTL scales really, really nicely with your estimated body mass. Now this is shown on a log scale just to be able to fit the data a little bit better. Otherwise, it's a really huge variation. And what we're plotting over is age, years. So this is 40,000 years ago on the left, trending towards today on the right. And we show different species here. We'll get into this a little bit later. But just note they're basically the same. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But what's important is that over that same 40,000 year time period is climate has been changing. Greenland Ice Sheet Project 2, GISP 2, has been drilling, well, done now, but they drilled down through the center of the Greenland ice sheet as deep as they could go, and they were able to reconstruct from delta oxygen relative global temperature per mil. And really what this ends up equating to is the last glacial maximum, roughly 25,000 years ago, was approximately 6 degrees cooler than it is today. And so we can transform both the bison body size and that temperature data into one graph. And what we see then as we map those, relate those two together as this linear trend where bison decrease in body size as it's warming. And again, we're showing these different species and their trends. But importantly, when we combine all of those species together, that trend becomes even steeper to the tune of losing 63 kilograms per 1 degree centigrade globally. And so what that ends up penciling out to is bison were almost twice as big that they are today. They dropped by not quite 50%, about 40-some%. But what we're expecting to change again is another halving of body size. So body size has these huge consequences for life history traits, producing meat, et cetera. So it touches every aspect of how bison are raised today. So flipping now towards mechanistic rather than pattern driven, we're going to blend some of that still together, but we're also particularly going to narrow in our time frame. We're no longer talking thousands of years. But let's reframe the question. If bison are getting smaller, how does physiology respond? Are we able to bend that curve, or can we explain the curve that we're seeing? And so these two papers will be the focus for what we talk about in this next section. During my dissertation, I visited 19 bison herds, ranging from Saskatchewan to Texas. And one herd in particular is a fantastic temporal reconstruction. The star here, number 9, is Wind Cave National Park. They've been keeping detailed measures of their bison since the very late 60s, since 1966 to today. And then spatially, these 19 sites I visited bison in 1 year. We'll get to that why twice here shortly. But let's dive into the temporal record. Let's just look at decades. So we're going from thousands of years to decades. In the Black Hills at Wind Cave National Park, WICA, we have Palmer drought severity index that we can monitor through time, as well as temperature. And so the left side is that Palmer drought, where we have relatively wet years, growth, to dry years, where we have the little poor little shrubs here. And what's important is to notice that in the late 30s is the Dust Bowl. And that average of that decadal measure is a -2. We're approaching that today as we get drier and drier and drier through 100 years of record keeping. Similarly, on the temperature side, the right side of the graph, we have relatively cool temperatures 100 years ago and general warming. And again, the Dust Bowl, relatively warm and has this decadal average. We're above that decadal average now. We're almost as dry and we're warmer than the Dust Bowl. Just context. And this is only for Wind Cave. And so what we've been able to do is taking those several thousand observations over multiple decades from Wind Cave is create this relationship of body height. They've been measuring the height directly and the body mass directly. So we can reconstruct this growth pattern for males and females. And once we figure out that those decadal measures of body size, repeated measures, and we have ontogeny, we have absolute mature body mass figured out. That's what the dark points are representing for males and females here. And so the decadal Palmer drought index is going to shift from decade to decade. But on the right side with the temperature, that is lined up from left to right to 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s in a nice sequence because it's been a gradual warming. And really what we find is that drought drives body mass declines to the tune of 17 kilos per unit of Palmer drought. On top of that, we also still see that temperature is driving body size declines to the tune here locally of 115 kilos per degree centigrade, as opposed to the -63, it's now -115. And so what I wanted to do was apply what we learned from one place over time to many places over a snapshot. And so I took photogrammetry images of bison and used photogrammetry to figure out the real world size of these animals. And so, for example, if we had an animal in my image that came out to be 1.5 meters tall and say it was a female, it's probably somewhere around 600 kilos. Do that over and over and over and over again for all the animals that I took pictures of over my data set. And so we're able to do that same premise of bringing in that local climate, relate that here, and then apply or figure out the regressions. And so again, we have Palmer drought on the left, where it's wet on the left and dry on the right. We have this decline to the tune of about 16 kilograms. That holds true. It's very similar to the temporal reconstruction that we already did with Wind Cave. On the right, we have temperature. And now it says we're losing mass by 1 kilogram per centigrade. Now, remember that this is over geographic space, right? And so we have basically Saskatchewan on the left, going down south through the Great Plains until we get into Texas on the right. And so this is contextualizing our geography matters, location, location, location. And so then we can apply through time. We have a spatial temporal model that we can now try and better resolve projections of body size. That camera I was using was a special camera. It's a thermal imaging camera. And on the top left is kind of how I was set up. I was in a side-by-side UTV, visiting various herds. You can see very darkly the thermal image as it's coming across. But then focused here is a much better representation of, hate to call them a family unit, but it's a bull, a cow, and a calf that are here. And what's important is the scale of color. That's what I'm trying to get you used to now. Dark colors are cool, both in the hue, but also the temperature, that each pixel can pick up and tell us what the temperature is at that spot. And so I have a little video here if I can work, here we go. So this is in South Dakota in 2017. And oh, there's a little calf. Hi, little calf. This was a very hot day that a cool front had just blown through. And so she's taken advantage of that thermal difference, where she's got this thermal window dumping a bunch of heat out of her abdomen. Right here, if you see, there's really, really bright colors, as well as her horn. And so horn acts as a radiator. In fact, there is a complex vessel of blood vessels at the base of the brain called the carotid artery that shunts blood to the horns, if you have horns. I wish I had horns just for this, because bison don't sweat. They don't really have a whole lot of sweat mechanism like what we have. And so they need to have non-evaporative methods for cooling down, which pretty much limits you to convection. You wait for wind to come through to take it away. And so really what we learned from this is all of the places I visited, both in the winter time, yes, Saskatchewan in winter, yay, and in the summertime, Texas in summer, hooray. Notice the temperature that it was on the days that I was visiting. We're looking at -25, almost -30 centigrade in the wintertime, and up to almost 40 degrees in the summer. I will put the laser pointer back on for anyone who has a smaller screen. And so really what that says is that it really does matter day to day to day what happens. But we can take the accumulation of those days as a representation of our climates. Notice that the trend lines are vastly different. Well, why might this be? Oh, right, because they molt. They shed their hair from season to season. They get very fluffy. Don't pet the fluffy cows, is a saying, because they're so fluffy in the wintertime. They have a lot of hair. In the summertime, they shed it down. They're still brown, but there's almost no hair left on their abdomen. They're exposing that thermal window in the summertime when it's hot. And location, location, location. This is a test of Bergmann's rule going back to 1847. And so that states that animals at a higher latitude are often larger in body size. We found that to be true. Bison are 30% larger in the north than they're in the south. But that also translates to heat. That's the underlying mechanism here. Is on the left side, heat flux. The more negative it is, the more heat you have leaving the body. A positive is absorbing energy, heat flux. And so the more heat you're trying to disperse, the hotter you are. And so we see this over a latitude. So left is Texas in this instance, and right is Saskatchewan. And that has trade-offs. Having a hotter body means you have to determine how you're going to allocate your energy. And so these hotter climates, more total surface heat transfer, you are using more energy for thermoregulation than your counterparts that live in a cooler climate that can then allocate it towards growth. So we have this trade-off for physiology. And that body size matters. I've been trying to get that to this point now, and some of you may be asking, why do we care about body size? Well, life history traits scale with body size in many, many instances. One example here is longevity. How long do they live, their lifespan? So here I'm showing females from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's the years that they were born. And we tracked how long do they live at Wind Cave. And we have this decline in body size, as well as a decline in their age on the right, their age in years. And so we have a 21.5 degrees, 90th percentile age of females in the 70s, trending down to 16.5. Well, Jeff, come on, I thought you said you had data up until 2015 or 2016. I did, but the animals are still living. They haven't died yet. If any animals that were born in 2000s, at the time I did this analysis, it was 2017, so they may not have all died yet. And so next decade, I suppose we're in it now, I could probably look at that data if they update that data set. Other life history traits include reproduction. Will they become more like deer? As they get smaller, will they twin more often? That's assuming that they can get enough nutrition to support twins. And so it's really unseen. We don't know what's actually going to happen. And so that's going to have trade-offs with your overall productivity in recruitment, as well as probably trade-offs with your sex demographic. And so this has implications for translocations. Bison live in a fragmented landscape. They no longer have the ability to do their natural migrations. And so we do assisted migrations, translocations. And we want to know what happens when you literally pick up a bison, put it on a trailer, shown here, from, say, Western South Dakota, and drop them off somewhere in, say, I don't know, Northern Indiana, a much more humid climate that has a lot more other ability to have parasites, because parasites, most parasites, not all, do like wetter climates and hotter climates. So what happens as we have intergenerational changes? This is a new project, so stay tuned for results. I hope to be able to share them in the next couple of years. And so summarize the eco-evo side of what we've talked about. We want to see body size as it declines, reduces longevity, reduces reproduction, decreases meat production. You have a smaller frame, you don't have as much meat on them. And one thing that we also see in the paleontology record that I didn't cover today is that high variation of body size of a species increases your chance of extinction. And so I don't mean to be all doom and gloom here, but there are some real consequences for what we're seeing. And it's not just bison, this is applicable to other species. And so bison management, let's jump to that last piece. It's great to have all this information, but what do we do with it? How do we actually implement it? Well, we need to understand bison manager perceptions. And how do they perceive climate change? How do they perceive other issues that affect them? And how does all of the above that we've talked about, everything, affect the bison management system? And I'll focus on two papers here that I've been a part of to help discuss some of that. So the bison management system, the BMS, is a system that maps the domains of any system, so physical, biological, economic, and social, up in the upper left, mapping those to ecosystem services. So our physical domain is largely represented by supporting and green for biological and regulating, etc. So all the sectors together, they have then a balanced emphasis across these ecosystem services. It is unique because North American model for wildlife management, the public system, as they manage parks across these lands, focus on supporting and cultural. It's same for bison systems. And here we're lumping together NGOs, so those nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy, American Prairie Reserve, excuse me, Prairie Reserve, etc. But it's not quite the same because it excludes the other sectors of the bison management system. There's a very large system with the production side where, yes, the emphasis is on provisioning, and that's why that bubble's a little bit larger than the other ones. But it still contributes to supporting and regulating. Bison is still a bison. The behavior is there to help restore prairies. And the other sector that we haven't talked a lot about is tribal sector. They have a lot of bison on their lands. They have a large footprint. Their emphasis is going to be more cultural, but still, because it is a bison system, it has the other ecosystem services represented. You have to think of this as a holistic systems thinking. And this system is wholly interconnected. There are 60,000 head of the bison population today that are sold and shipped annually. And so from the public system, we have repatriation to the tribal sector. States, so Custer State Park, Antelope Island in Utah, and a few other places, they sell their bison surplus as money to come in to help support their conservation efforts. Nature Conservancy does the same thing with their surplus. And so those are monies that go often from the animal goes to the private, the dollar is scoped from private back. We also see many surplus sales from tribal organizations, often purchased by the private entity. When you visit a park, you can go to a restaurant and eat a bison steak. I've been to Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. They both in their restaurants have bison meat for sale, either as a burger or a steak. Those aren't the animals from that place. They're from the private sector. And so there's this ecotourism meshing that comes together. So they're highly interconnected. What happens in one affects the other. And I think we briefly talked about this at the top of the talk, but the bison population by sector is disparate. Tribal and public about the same, about 20,000 apiece. NGOs are about 10,000, and the private is above 180,000. And so we have this interconnected population that just seems to be skewed, but it is important to include all managers. And so what I did was implemented a survey instrument to better understand bison managers. So I had 156 respondents. It's about a 15% response rate. Those of you unfamiliar with working with surveys, that's actually a pretty good response rate. Usually you expect about 10% response. Many of them were from the private sector, which ends up proportional to the bison population ownership. We did have too few of the tribal sector. So what I talk about for the analyses after this will be excluding the tribal sector, mainly because I don't think it would paint an accurate portrayal, although they often score highly across this. I also wanted to see if there were regional or grassland type differences. Really trying to break this up at the really large scales, so north, central, south, and east versus short, tall, and mixed grass. Ultimately, these ecoregions did not pan out to have any statistical differences. They are relatively consistent across the landscape, which is interesting. But what we did get into was diving in on values, attitudes, and practices. And so what we're going to show here are public and NGOs being grouped together. They often have very similar goals and mandates that align well, and then against the private sector. And so their values towards ecological values are both on the right side in the blue, which is agree, and particularly it's strongly agree. That is an emphasis of why they choose to manage bison. The attitudes of these ideas that you hold towards a certain aspect. So hunting, are you pro or against hunting? Prescribed burning, are you pro or against it? And so we can go through that step by step by step. And really what this ends up coming down to is a cognitive dissonance. And really what I mean by that is these ideas that you have, you believe in these things, you really want to do them, but what do you actually do on the ground? There's practices. And so we see this large skew, particularly in the public NGO sectors, that they can't do it. And in particular, it's highlight parasite practices. So on the right, we see this difference of NGO and public sector saying, no, we don't do this. But we would like to. They're more likely being constrained by their mandates, their management mandates and goals that higher ups place on them. So it's a top-down control pressure. And same thing with disease, monitoring and treatment. And so those vaccination attitudes, yeah, we'd like to do it, but we're unable to.
Jeff, sorry, a quick time check. We're at 11:45.
Great, I have maybe 3 slides left. And so I do want to talk a little bit about the tribal sector here. On a paper that came out early this year, there were 30 of us authors on it, mostly from the tribal sector, represented by these 4 reservations. They have been reintroducing bison in some of these places since the 60s, and maybe even earlier than that. And so they've been restoring bison to their lands for quite some time. Some of these are more recent, like Rosebud and D. They've only recently started to reintroduce bison here over the last few years. And really what we wanted to show and highlight was these case studies are able to meet both their cultural needs, as well as ecological, as well as economic. And so what they have found to be the most successful part is prioritizing both a herd for cultural and ceremonial purposes and a secondary herd for meat production, economic. So you can either sell the animals for cash, or you are butchering these animals for meat, and that meat stays nearby. So you don't have a food desert. And this was just a really fun project to be a part of. I really enjoyed having our discussions with all of these groups. There was a question before the leading up to today in the sign-up registration about native grasses and non-native grasses in response to bison grazing. The best thing I can show is a very recent paper by Zach Radajak out of KSU at the Kanza Biological Station near Manhattan, Kansas. And so really what they've been running for the last 30 years is a long-term experiment of bison-only grazing spots, cattle-only grazing spots, and then totally ungrazed spots. And what we see from their data here are that percent grass cover is increasing with ungrazed areas, staying relatively consistent with cattle in the blue, and total grass cover is declining with bison. Now, it's not meaning that there is bare soil. What it means is that we actually are seeing fords coming through. And so these other native species richness are actually increasing, switching out of grass and more towards these flowering plants. And so again, the red is bison. So we have this increase in the top right and bottom right through time with the species richness of native plants. A relative staying the same with a grazed system, but with cattle, and ungrazed staying very low. And what this climate extreme is showing is a major drought over a 2-year period. And in particular, what we're seeing is this resiliency, the ability to rebound, if not even go further than what was leading up to that. So we have this cattle in the blue staying relatively flat line through the years. This drought event occurs. We see a decline in both the cattle and bison system for those native species richnesses. But then we have a recovery on the bison side that's gone well above the global 95th percentile of your native species richness. And so bison can facilitate those recoveries. And this leads me to what's next. Very recently, my team and several of us here at South Dakota State have received an award from USDA to help partner climate smart commodities together. And so really what we're focusing on here with our group is getting bison and beef to work together to be climate smart, meaning we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're sequestering more carbon into the grounds, and using less fossil fuels to do so. And so in sum, we have our eco-evo models are predicting that bison body mass will halve by 2100 under a 4-degree warming scenario from 665 to 357. Warming stunts those growth rates, so that's the mechanism behind it. Those declines have consequences. We have life history traits and productivity will decline. However, there are still some other sides of the leaf. Food security and food sovereignty is enhanced with bison. So not everything is down. We just need to figure out how to do it better. And part of that includes addressing our vulnerabilities. Every day that we don't do adaptation, those vulnerabilities accrue. And it is deferred maintenance, and that only becomes costlier later. One step towards that is this climate smart commodities. That's a large investment into trying to get everybody on board, including tribal bison herds. Our group, our grant has every single sector represented in the bison side. And so we hope to address this moving forward. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a remarkable presentation. You can see some some comments in the chat regarding that. Yeah, we don't have any questions that got submitted in our chat box, so I've just opened it up. I'll just open it up to everybody. You can unmute yourself. You can also show your video if you like, and please go ahead if you have any questions or comments for Jeff.
Not all at once.
Hi, Jeff. I have a quick question. I've long heard a rumor that all existing bison in North America do have some bovine gene. They've all at some point interbred with cattle. Is that true or false?
I am reducing my screen so I can see who's talking to me. Hello, Tony.
Got a nice bison photo in the background here.
Yes, you do. Great question. So that research team that started this back in the late 80s and 90s is out of Texas A&M. That group has had a very recent publication this year that's reevaluating that exact question and issue. And so back in the 90s, we didn't have whole genome sequencing, right? We just had really just mitochondrial DNA and just a few markers that we could use. But now we can do whole genome sequencing. And what we're learning is that it is a profuse occurrence of these beef genetic information and material across every single herd, including what we consider our gold standard, Yellowstone, does have this, now that we look at the entire whole genome. And so it now begs the question of, these animals are really closely related. In fact, they can still crossbreed today, but can only do that because they're so closely related ancestrally. They do share a common ancestor not that long ago. So is it a matter of incomplete lineage sorting, evolution? Have they just not diverged because there hasn't been enough time? Or is it because we've actually done this breeding, forcing them together? And that was really the last opportunity that a lot of these conservationists had. There was less than 1,000 animals left. They did the best that they could with what they had. And at this point, we have what we have. We can't change it. And so we need to work with what we have. And I think what we have a bigger issue with is climate change.
I see Miranda has a hand up.
See Miranda.
Hi,
Hello.
I apologize for not having a video, but one of my questions is, and I apologize if I missed this, but how the age per size was calibrated. One of the things that I'm curious about that might play into this mix is sort of the different human selection of which animals get removed from the population, right? In some populations, we're removing all the large, big animals, and some we're removing all the small ones, and it varies. And so I'm kind of wondering how that might affect this. Like you were talking about longevity. In some of these populations, we don't know what the longevity is because they don't stay in the population long enough. So I was kind of curious if they're, when you were doing your sizing, if you were also trying to age them, and if there's a way to tease out management in a way that would maybe help counter some of those effects of climate change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, growth happens over time. For an individual that grows, it's called ontogeny. And I took that into account. So I do have a known age for every individual here. I just didn't show it because it'd add another slide that I have to talk you through. So I did skip a couple parts, but yes, I did account for ontogeny and the age and sex at that time. And what we actually end up finding is that asymptotic body mass, we can model that with a Gompertz growth curve, even if they haven't achieved full mature mass, we can still model it because we know what that trajectory is. We just need 2 of the 3 points figured out because they have finite growth, and we know what that slope is. So that's a great question. And so when we did do that across those 19 places across the entire Great Plains, what we found was that our models were explaining 94% of the body size variance by climate, not by selection. But as you point out, management does affect, say you want bigger, stronger animals like we see in the cattle industry. Could our selection bend that curve? It's very possible. And that might be what we're seeing with some of these measures, but that's why I try to use a blend of all of the sectors. So we have all of those management coming across. It's now my next step for my research in my lab of better pulling apart some of those threads. Great question, Miranda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question about, thanks for the presentation. That was really, really informative and thought-provoking. And just to go way sort of back, when you had the 3 different bison species and climate over time, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what the relationship was between those bison species, and if perhaps they came from different populations, or where did the speciation happen? And how did that biogeography work? And are they from the same populations, et cetera? So I was wondering if you could just sort of talk about that.
Yeah, really good question, Adam. Yeah, so those 3 species that I think you're referring to is the Bison antiquus, Bison occidentalis, and bison when I showed the body size decline over the fossil history. More recent work, again, going into genetics, is ancient DNA. And so we've been able to recover the whole genome sequences now for these ancient populations. And so when we try to compare those apart and try to pull them apart and say that these are different, the data keeps saying that they're actually not that different, that they more likely are the same species. And paleontologically, morphologically, the only difference that we're seeing is size. Often we're going to be using other landmarks, like, are the teeth different? Are they shaped in different ways? Do they have a crenulation where it shouldn't be, et cetera? Other things that pull them apart and are distinct. We don't see those in those 3 species of bison. And so they're all living here in North America, just at different times. So there's going to be a lot of microevolution occurring, right? Epigenetics. But it's the macroevolution that we cared about in that particular. That's why I said it's a trend, a pattern that we can compare to. And that's why we need to dive more into these questions today of the nuances for wildlife sciences, and how do we integrate tighter resolution of haplotypes, for example. Would those be different enough with these, likely using SNPs and other ways to identify these haplotypes? We can try and get at that. But as we work with fossil evidence, there's a lot of degradation that occurs. So we do the best we can with what we have, but they all need to influence each other. I don't know that I answered it 100%, but it's also that front edge of science right now.
Yeah, that was great. I just wanted to sort of hear a little bit more about that. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. I see Laura's hands up, so let's do that quickly. Go ahead, Laura.
Hey, thank you. I'm wondering more from like the ecological perspective. So if the individuals are getting smaller, is it a magnitude enough that their caloric needs are decreasing, and that there's potentially a larger herd size capacity or grazing capacity for like commercial for production systems? Just like kind of thinking about that interaction on the landscape. Has the thinking gone that way, or are we not? Are we talking still like a much longer period? So that's not really quite in our management thinking yet.
Yeah, great question. Yes, that would be, we would hope that be the case. As you get smaller, you can maybe have more animals. So it's the same number of pounds per acre, just as a brief example. But with really large ruminants, specifically cattle and bison, any animals that are above 300 kilos are now gaining that much more efficiency, because their gut retention time is increasing much faster. So they hold that that forage, poor forage in particular, much longer, so they can extract everything from it. Bison in Texas and New Mexico, the females, they're at that 300 kilos now. that is their maximum size. As you go below that, you're now losing efficiency at huge losses. And so you don't have that same gut retention time to extract the nutrients you need from poor forages. On top of that, our best models, there's a lot of models, but MT has his models, I'll blame him, are saying that our productivity of grasses probably aren't even going to stay up anyway. So even if we had decreasing body sizes and we have this decreasing forages, you see where I'm going with this, right? Is everything's losing productivity. And I don't know that this is going to be great. And so, yeah, it's a problem. I don't have an answer yet, but that's part of my research program.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much again, Jeff. Such an excellent topic. I'm sure there are many more comments and questions, and I'm going to stop our recording at this point, and we'll transition into our informal session. And I really encourage, if you have other comments and questions, please stay around. If you can't, we'll hope to see you hopefully next month. So take care, everyone, and thanks again for being here. And thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.